I'm delighted to be here talking to you at the Annual Justice and Peace Conference for three reasons, really. First, when you've got a majority of 249 like I have in Keighley, you're delighted to be anywhere, to be honest. As it says on the brief biography of me, I have been a Member of Parliament in Selby and then in Keighley, and my perhaps only political distinction is there are only 3 MPs since the war who've won 2 different seats with less than 500 votes. But you notice not being an MP when you're not an MP, and in that intervening period, 2010 to 2017, I did various other things, 1 or 2 which I'll touch on. But I remember going back to my old constituency for the first time in Selby, about a year after I'd retired. I was going back to help some of the local councils in the local elections. And so I thought, what would be the reaction? So I knocked rather nervously on the first door and wondered whether anyone would possibly recognise me. The chap opened the door, he certainly recognised me. He paused for a moment before saying anything, and he looked at me and he said, the return of the living dead. nothing more excellent except being. Equally that same summer, I'm a big cricket fan, and cricket will feature in my remarks a little bit later on as well. And I was going around my beloved Headingley, and I was on my own. Cricket's one of those things that you can do on your own, I think. And I got a pint at lunchtime, so walking in front of the stand. It wasn't packed, so it was a county game, but there was a brief pause in play, and then this chap, I had my pint in my hand, and this chap voice boomed down from the back of the stand. Lad, you can't put that on expenses now. It was mildly amusing the first time he said it, but as he said it every day of the summer I was there, I took to walking behind the stand with my lunchtime pint. Anyway, but I'm back now as an MP. And secondly, it is a great honour to be here on the 40th anniversary, and obviously many connections with the Diocese of Leeds. And thirdly, what a topic, an inclusive Britain. And so I intend to give you 10 observations on an inclusive Britain, not a 10-point plan really, but 10 observations from, if you like, some from a Catholic standpoint, some from a standpoint of my political beliefs. I will touch on Brexit just briefly, because it'd be rude not to, wouldn't it? It'd be rude not to. I just reflect in passing that, and kindly mentioned the all-party groups I'm involved in, and MPs can get mixed up as well in international relations, just as ministers. One all-party group that I don't share, but a friend of mine does, is Portugal. And I can recall when I was last at MP, it was Portuguese National Day. And my friend, his wife and family were coming, so he said, can you go down to the Portuguese embassy and give the greetings of Parliament on this day? I said, all right, then you owe me a favour, but I'll go. And so it was a wild and wet December night, and I got in a taxi, and I went down to get the address of the Portuguese embassy, and got out of the car, it was pouring down, got inside, made small talk for half an hour, and then I said, I better go and give greetings to the Portuguese ambassador. So I found him, and I said, I'm sorry it's not the main man, but I'm here giving greetings from Parliament to Portugal, England's oldest ally. We love your fado music, we love your food, we love everything about Portugal. And he put his shoulders back and he said, that is a very fine speech, but this is the Spanish embassy. And I am the Spanish ambassador. And we are certainly not England's oldest ally. So, a few more serious remarks about Brexit in a moment. But just before I start with my 10 observations, I suppose to have an inclusive Britain, you need an inclusive church as well, insofar as we can contribute to that inclusive Britain through Justice and Peace and through all the different organisations. And I was reading the other week that there's obviously been debates down the centuries about what an inclusive church is, and one particular writer I saw contrasted the views of John the Baptist and Jesus, if you like, that John the Baptist was keen on a conversion, and Jesus found people as he found them, really, and hobnobbed with tax collectors and all sorts of people. And I think it's an exciting time for the church. There'll be different views in the room, but I'm obviously not as much an expert as my brother, who's a priest, and I hasten to add that none of my views are his. I assured you last week that I made that clear. But I think, you know, it is an exciting moment with the Pope. The joy of the gospel was one of his earlier works as a Pope, and I think that I've always been a Catholic who's, obviously there's lots of misery, lots of injustice in the world, but I equally think we should emphasise the joy, and I think we're in an exciting time, and I hope that the changes that are happening in the church will continue. I pray for a long life for the Pope, and you know, I think one of the good things in Parliament, just in passing actually, I'll mention this, is the change between 2010 and 2017 in Catholic organisation in Parliament. Some of you who are involved in organisations may be aware of that. There's now a regular group of MPs. We have a Mass every Wednesday in the chapel, which goes back 800 years. The various organisations like CAFOD, Justice and Peace, Caritas and so on, they all seem to organise and give us briefings. People like the Cardinal come in and give speeches and so on before Mass. And so there is that, it's called the Catholic Legislators Network, and we went to Rome just after Easter and had incredible access. And I just leave you with one little anecdote there. We met obviously people very high up in the church, and I remember one of our party asked a cardinal I won't name, but he's very, very close to the Pope. He said, will there ever be, for example, married priests in the church? Will there ever be women priests in the church? Cardinal reflected for a moment and said that it wouldn't happen under this papacy because it would require a Vatican Council. There's obviously only been 2 of those in recent history. But who knows in the future, he said, and it was a question of changing culture. So from my point of view, that's a symbol of great hope. These things take great time, but I do think it's incumbent on us, and I just mentioned it in passing, when we're talking about an inclusive Britain, we have to reflect on our own church as well. Which brings me to point number 1, really, which is schools. This is a specifically Catholic point, because I think we should be so proud of our Catholic schools. And in recent debate, we've somehow, I think, managed to get ourselves on the wrong side of the debate. Some of you will be more familiar with this than others, but many parishes have been writing into me, many Catholics saying we need to change the rules on free schools. These are the schools that are on the government agenda, separate from local authority schools, and that at the moment the law is that you've got to have, if you have a faith school, you've got to have 50% of non-faith in the school, and we've been arguing that this is anti-Catholic and so on. The government have now come back and said they're not going to change the rule, but what they're going to look at is the old voluntary aided schools, which are most of the Catholic schools in the country, and whether they can be expanded. There's no money there at the moment, but in a way I don't think that is a bad response, because when you look at Catholic schools at the moment, 1/3 of pupils in Catholic schools are not Catholic. Now, I very fully support the idea of a Catholic ethos of a school, very, very strongly, and obviously you need Catholic kids in a Catholic school to make it Catholic. But I think part of the modern mission of Catholic education, perhaps different from decades in the past, is to bind, this is where we get to inclusivity, is to bind together elements of our society and bring them together to encounter each other when otherwise they wouldn't. So, for example, to give you one concrete example, Our Lady of Victory School in Keighley came down to Parliament the other week. A pretty poor area they represent. About 40% Catholic, 40% Muslim, 20% not quite sure. And yet I went to the school. It's really real Catholic ethos in the school. And I went just after they had the nativity play. So I asked the head, did this cause any problems? You've been doing this nativity play. Do you get any complaints? And he said, yeah, he did have one complaint the previous week. That one of the, you might call one of the matriarchs in the Muslim community, who now had grandchildren at the school, had come in with a big file. And she said she'd been coming to the nativity play for 20 years. And she had a serious complaint to make. She had kept a record of who had played Jesus every one of those 20 years. And on the statistics of the school, Jesus should have been a Muslim 2 more times. So, I think that school is getting something right in Keighley. And And in fact, in Keighley, a lot of the schools are completely segregated, a lot of the state schools. Not because they have to be, but because that's parental choice and so on and things. So I think that is part of our mission of church schools, not just Catholic schools, but church schools. And indeed our own Home Secretary, who is a Muslim, he wasn't educated in a Catholic school, but at Church of England school, and he talked how important it was to him. Second thing I want to talk about as observation is justice, really, because it obviously is in your title, and I think it's often not high enough up the political agenda as it should be. Representing quite a poor area, what I recognise more than anything is many people in Keighley who are the victims of injustice, whether that be they've got involved in benefit sanctions, in many cases not their own fault and so on, or whether they're fighting a private landlord who's neglecting their housing and so on and things, is a lack of an advocate. It is a lack of someone to speak up on their behalf. And I know many of you are involved in organisations that do that. The SVP in my constituency are very, very active at going to tribunals and representing people, because we just don't have the staff in the office to go to every tribunal. And legal aid now is, in many parts of the country, there is a legal aid desert, or at best there is one firm providing legal aid. And I do think, I'm a big believer in the Human Rights Act and so on, and I think the reason I am is ultimately that gives power to those who are marginalised or derided in society, and it gives them a potential way of making the case. But you can only do that, whether it's going to a benefit sanction tribunal or whether it's going to court, if you have those that power of advocacy. And often you don't have to be poor, you don't have to be working class, you can be middle class or any point in society. Often people are their own worst advocates. We all know the story, don't you? You feel passionately about something that's affected you, and it's for a reason that people, trade unions, always want to go in the room with someone who's under a disciplinary or whatever. And so I think that lack of legal aid and advocacy is important. And just touching on it, and I know many people do work in prisons, and as a society, we really need to look at our prisons. We do jail far more than virtually every other European country. I know some of you are involved in prison visiting and so on. And the new Minister for Justice, actually, to be fair, made a very important speech in the spring when he talked about these things. Obviously, it's a question of committing resources, but also it's a question of not jailing people who don't need to be jailed, who are better doing community service, but those who are coming out of jail. A job is the key thing, isn't it? And national insurance concessions for employers who employ people directly out of jail is one thing the new Minister of Justice suggested, and I think that's a good thing. Thirdly, just moving on to third observation on an inclusive Britain. At some point we're going to have to face up to social care in our society. If you look round in the front row here, we'll take the front row here, and the front row there, and me. Probably one or two of us will require fairly intensive social care at the end of our lives. We don't know which one or two it will be, but that's the truth of it, isn't it? And we have a society now where obviously some people are lucky enough to own their own house. I just about own my own house and so on and things, but it's a bit of a lottery as to social care at the end of life. If ever there was a case for a collective solution, I think this is it. And there's various ways of doing it. I would float the idea of those who are lucky to own their own houses would one solution to be to have an inheritance tax on most of those houses of maybe 10-15%. So you'll be absolutely certain that you would have most of your inheritance, but you would have to give 10-15% to the state, and then everyone who requires social care will get it for free in latter years. And certainly I think it was a big issue at the last general election, and we have to do something. And I also think that those who work in social care, we've got to give enough resources that they're properly rewarded, because how can you expect people rushing around, and obviously you want to keep people at home for as long as possible, but when people have only got 15 minutes to give care, that is not good enough. Moving on now to number 4, and I'll just touch, there may be questions on Brexit things, I'll just touch on Brexit, but in a different context. I represent a small town, or a number of small towns. Silsden is one of them, Keighley is another, Ilkley over the hill is the other. Ilkley is very affluent, and the great and the good and their children of West Yorkshire live there, and they voted Remain. The other side of the hill, Keighley and Silsden, didn't. And I think there is, regardless of the merits of Brexit, and I'm a Remainer, I'm a hopeless Remainer, but regardless of the merits of Brexit, I think there is in our country a lot of small towns, whether they're seaside towns, whether they're former industrial towns, are feeling marginalised. And as a country, I think we have to address this. In Yorkshire, I'm particularly keen on Yorkshire devolution, and I mean, I'm Mayor of Yorkshire because everyone else seems to be getting it. But no, seriously, I think we needn't just talk about big cities. I mean, many of the big cities of the north in particular, and there are success stories over the last 20, 30 years, and one of the big success stories, and there's divisions within cities certainly, but one of the big success stories has been the revival of all those big northern cities, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, Hull. Who would ever have thought that capital country in Hull 20, 25 years ago? It's fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And so, those cities have had lots of investment and so on. There is obviously divisions and poverty within the cities, but nevertheless, I think it's time that we look at a small town Britain as well. Small town Britain, which largely voted Brexit. Just to finish on that, what's going to happen? Your guess is as good as mine. But the key vote is in Parliament in November or December, which will be on the deal, or whatever deal comes up. I'm on the Northern Ireland Committee, and I'll refer to Ireland in a moment, and obviously there's particularly tensions there. If Parliament, people ask me, will there be another referendum? If Parliament was to say no to that deal, there would then be a number of options, of which a referendum would be one, and indeed might, in those circumstances, be attractive to both political parties, but we shall see. But November or December is when it will be all decided. Income gaps in our country, I know you've discussed this quite a bit, and so I won't dwell on it excessively, but I think we have become a society when the gaps between rich and poor are now indefensible. There are some good things. One thing that David Cameron said was that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and from very soon all the big companies in our nation are going to have to give their ratios of the chief executive compared with the median earner in the company, and also the lowest earners in the company. And I think that we are a more divided society than many other European nations. Minimum wage is obviously a very, very welcome development, and hopefully at some stage we'll move on to a living wage as well. The environment you've touched on, and indeed was reflected in our opening prayers. One of the things I did when I was not an MP was I chaired the last but one coal mine to close in our country, in Hatfield, and that was an employee-owned mine. It was went through several bankruptcies, and in the end the bank just handed it over to the employees, the Dutch bank, because they didn't really want the reputational risk. So we were faced with trying to, it's never easy in life, is it, to try and end something well, because we knew we were ending it, and coal miners were not daft. They knew it was an industry that was going. But we did our best anyway over a period of time. But I mentioned it that in cleaning up our planet and dealing with global warming, we've also got to use the best scientific human ingenuity to make that transition as easy as possible for many people whose lives depend on it. And even though coal mines have disappeared now from the United Kingdom, they haven't from the world. In China and India, coal mines are opening pretty well every week of the year. And one technology that we have in the United Kingdom, which I think needs further to be developed, is carbon capture and storage. In Yorkshire, there's a plan that a lot of the emissions from the industry in Yorkshire could be piped past Drax Power Station, including some of the emissions from Drax Power Station, into the old North Sea oil fields and gas fields. You know, that is, I think, one idea that needs to be looked at. Identity. We're on to number 7 now. Who's got Irish roots and identity in the room? Yes, well, very good indeed. Well, I me as well. And in fact, Grogan in Gaelic means the wild, fierce, hairy one. So obviously lost something in the genes. I mentioned that because I think this is one thing that Catholics can contribute to wider British debate about identity, because over my lifetime, perhaps the greatest political achievement, I would say, in Britain and Ireland is peace in Ireland. And obviously it's not completely without difficulty now, and we hope and pray for the return of the devolution and the executive and so on, but it was nevertheless a major step forward that some people said would never happen. I can remember going into the Maze prison, because I was on the Northern Ireland Committee last time around, and there was the IRA wing and there was the Protestant wing, and the prison officers never went on the wings by this stage. We're in the latter stages of the peace negotiations, and so it was as you'd imagine it. I went onto the slightly nervously onto the IRA wing, and everyone was doing a PhD in Gaelic history or literature, and then you'd go on to we met the young Protestant lads in the gym, and I'm still a bit of a five-a-side goalie, but I was a better five-a-side goalie in those days, and so I went in goals, and then I asked the prison officer as we left, what were these gentlemen in for then? And he said, everyone is a murderer. And, you know, those were let out, all of them were let out within 6 months as part of the peace process, and there's been very few cases of re-offending. And yet that was not an easy thing to argue for. I can remember going on Radio York, and there was a chap called Glenn Goodman, who was a policeman who was sadly murdered by the IRA at Tadcaster. He just happened to stop in the middle of the night an IRA car, which was going to commit an atrocity, and they shot him. And his parents said, well, obviously, they said that they couldn't possibly agree to the release of any IRA prisoners. And how do you argue against that? And I said, obviously, I respect your views, there's no way we can bring your son back. But what we hopefully can do is reach a situation whereby the sons and daughters of people in West Yorkshire and North Yorkshire don't have to go onto the streets of Belfast and be killed and risk their lives trying to keep the peace. And so something good has happened there, and I realised, sometimes you have a realisation, don't you, that something has changed. And it wasn't in the House of Commons that I realised that, it was actually in a pub that I realised it, and it was, it's a dangerous thing for an MP to go on. I think it was about 2009, but I agreed to go on a stag night, just for the early part of the evening, just for a couple of drinks, and England were playing Ireland at rugby, and you maybe remember the game. It was long before the Queen went, and the game was at Croke Park, not Lansdowne Road. And for those of you not sporting, Croke Park is the Gaelic game, Gaelic football game, and where there was a massacre many years ago with British forces involved. And so everyone thought, what would happen when the anthem was played? And of course, the biggest Irish guy in this pub, he went round his mates, I'll never forget it, and just before the anthems were played, he went round and said, we will respect the anthems, boys, we will respect the anthems. And absolute silence in this pub when God Save the Queen came on. And so I realised something had happened for the good then. It did help that Ireland beat England 36-10 to the general mood of our Irish friends, but nevertheless. But I tell that story, and I tell that story to Pakistanis and Bangladeshis in Keighley, because identities are multiple, aren't they? To have an inclusive Britain, people will approach it in different ways, and you know, I'm proud to be English and I'm proud to be British, but also you look to my Irish roots, and I'm proud of all, I think, in terms of geographical identity of Yorkshireness. And I do think with the experience of Ireland, that is something that we can bring to the table as Catholics. Moving quickly on now to point number 8.
let's not write off, and I suppose this would be a point of, sometimes I have discussions with CAFL colleagues about this. It is right to be suspicious about multinational companies over the last 50 years, and some of the injustices of some of the mining companies and so on and things, and in dealing with developing nations. But I think it is wrong for the church to stand back and not be in dialogue with, and not be involved in big private sector companies. I did and they can be great forces for good, and corporate social responsibility is now something that wasn't talked about 30, 40 years ago, but is now taken seriously by many of our best companies. And you mentioned Mongolia, which I only get involved, I have two criteria for the countries I get involved in. One is they're a democracy, and two, that a backbench MP can do something to improve their lot. The China group doesn't really need MPs, the Chinese embassy is perfectly capable of looking after itself. But a country like Mongolia is a developing nation, and it does have some mining wealth in terms of copper and gold and things like that, and it has a very literate population. A third of the population are in Gers. They live out in the countryside, but they all have solar power. They've all got solar power. So they can tell you about global warming. They can tell you who was the best player in the World Cup and so on and things. And so what Mongolia wants is not to be told, oh no, you can't have private sector investment, and you can't have good jobs. You're not really ready for that. What they need is extra capacity. They need good lawyers on their side negotiating the deals. They want to be part of the world. They're very, very proudly Mongolian, and they want help and assistance. And they have a third neighbour policy. They've got to keep Russia and China at bay, really. So they're very open to the rest of the world, but they don't want to be told they can't have some of the fruits of prosperity that we've got. I'll finish on Mongolia with one final story before I touch on my final 2 points. And that is, again, how careful you've got to be. Mongolia is very, very good at, not at team sports, but sports that involve one-to-one violence, really, like boxing and wrestling. I went to the Mongolian boxing championships once, and I was no longer an MP at this stage, so I had to find something to do, and I went off to Mongolia, and about halfway through, they rang the bell and they said they wanted to introduce me at half time. So they said, how do you want to be introduced? And I said, well, I want to be introduced as a good friend of Mongolia and a former MP. Will that do? So the message went up to the ring guy, and he made the announcement in Mongolian. And to my surprise, there was a standing ovation, which was not what I was used to as an ex-MP, or even as an MP. And anyway, so I said, what did he say? And he said, you were a good friend of Mongolia and a former English heavyweight boxing champion. You've always got to be careful. You've always got to be careful. Which brings me on nicely and neatly to my penultimate point, really, which is to do with, I haven't mentioned sport rather too much, but the Pope is a great fan of sport for Argentina, and I'm only going to give you two quotes, one from the Pope, and he said that sport is a human activity of great value, enjoyed by men and women of every nation, ethnic group, and religious belonging. And equally, someone who comes from a different philosophical background, Albert Camus, the great existentialist writer, and sometimes I think there are little connections there with our faith. But anyway, he said, after many years during which I saw many things, what I know most surely about morality and the duty of man I owe to sport. And I think I could commend CAFL, by the way, on their latest, they've been a lot of promotions around the World Cup and trying to bring out with school children the various injustices in the world, and how much the person who puts together the boots in Thailand gets compared with Ronaldo and so on and things like that, but also just the sheer joy of great events. And I do think that as well as housing, which I haven't had a chance to mention, health and education and so on, part of an inclusive Britain is when the Pope spoke of the joy of the gospel and so on, the good things in life should be, the good cultural and sporting things should be available to all of our nation, because they do bind us together. It's not, and I'll just give you one example, we all, or not everyone in the room, but is there anyone who didn't see any of the World Cup at all? Didn't even see 10, oh, more than, about 10 of them. So you did, yeah, so you didn't see any of it, but 90% saw something. And, you know, in Keighley, I just give two stories. We managed to get one of these and the reason, by the way, 90% of people saw it is we have a law that means that the big events like the World Cup and the Olympics must be on free-to-air TV. And we have a law, it's not an accident. And, you know, it's a small thing, but it is part of inclusive Britain that we can all enjoy those things. So, for example, in Keighley, at the rugby league ground, Keighley Cougars, very white area, we had a showing of the semi-final, and an Asian entrepreneur put up the screen, and it brought the area together. And we're going to follow that up with who's ever done a park run? Who's ever done a park run? Ah, there's a few here. Park run. So a park run is it's a free event. It's in our parks up and down the country. You may be passing a park. Lister Park, Manningham is an example in Bradford. 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, it's 5Ks. People do it for free, it doesn't cost them anything, there's voluntary activity, they can walk, they can run or whatever. And in Keighley, there's very few things that people do together. So we're starting a park run on the second Saturday in September, and I'm absolutely determined that we're going to have some Asian women, Bangladeshi and Kashmiri women, we're already working on it. And we're going to have some Asian men, and they're not all going to, you know, we want to raise eyebrows, because with that run in Bradford, young and old and so on, some people walk it, is a visible expression of what Bradford is now, and we want a bit of that in Keighley. So only sport, not only sport, but sport I think can do that. Finally then, my final reflection is don't give up on democracy really. Sometimes, you know, people say, well, nothing ever changes, or it's impossible to do anything. And there's examples we should be talking about today. I mean, obviously the big example Justice and Peace has been involved in with other groups is that now our nation gives less than a penny, but not much less than a penny, to poorer nations. And that came through struggle and through democracy, and people write emails and letters before there ever were emails. You know, to their MPs, and sometimes they thought they would never get there, but we did. That now both our major political parties support that goal. It would be wrong not to mention 100 years on from women having the vote. 100 years, our democracy is relatively young really. Only women over 30 got the vote, and people forget that actually a lot of men got the vote for the first time in 1918. A lot of men without property got that vote for the first time. Some men went to the First World War and they didn't have the vote. So it's a relatively, we are the mother of parliaments and proud to be so, but democracy is a relatively young thing in our nation, and you can make change. I am now in a minority amongst Labour MPs in Yorkshire, in that I'm a man. There are more women than there are men, and how often, and many people in Yorkshire don't realise that that change has come and gone. So I end, finally, my final story is: has anybody seen a play called This House? This House, yes, 1, 2, well, 3, 4. If you ever get a chance to see a play called This House, I think there's no better story about British contemporary democracy, and in the end, no more hopeful story as well. It doesn't sound very exciting, but I tell it because it was about a time when, very similar to now, no party had a majority in the House of Commons. It was in the 1970s when those of you who are old enough will remember, of course, it was Harold Wilson and then Jim Callaghan, the Prime Minister. And the government survived from day to day. And unlike now, they could sit up all night under the rules. So, in fact, 30 MPs died during that parliament. Partly, I suppose, the MPs were slightly older, possibly slightly less fit, but also they were up during the night. And so it finally got to that. So this play is written by a 30-year-old who's interviewed many of the people concerned. And the last, I'm going to it doesn't really spoil it because we all know how it ends. It ends with Miss Thatcher, obviously, in 1979. But we all know how it ends. But you know, the drama of that last confidence vote and it's of relevance to the last week and talks of chief whips and votes and so on. So that last vote, the Labour Whip's office, the action goes to the Labour Whip's office, and they know they're going to lose by 1. And there's a chap who's an MP, who is the MP, a lot of this is Yorkshire based actually. The Deputy Chief Whip is from Yorkshire, Walter Harrison. These names have long since forgotten by most people. And then there's a Labour MP who's dying in Batley, and the Conservative chairs of the constituencies of Yorkshire are all at Leeds Station waiting to see whether he would come down. And so the Labour Whip say, we always knew there'd be a line, we'll draw it here, so if we bring him down, he's dead. And, you know, so the Deputy Chief Whip said, well, we've got the weapon of bluff. So he went through to the Tory Chief Whip's office and said, we'll bring him down, you know we'll bring him down, we will do it if we have to. But it'll be on your conscience, so give us a pair, I demand a pair. Tory Deputy Chief Whip said, I cannot do that. Mrs Thatcher, she would never forgive me. She said, no pairs, because, you know, we're on the brink of power. And Walter Harrison said, well, we'll do it, you know we'll do it. And so the Tory Deputy Chief Whip looked at him and said, you've got a pair. And Walter said, I want to know who it is, And he said, it's me. And this chap was Jack Wetherell, actually, who subsequently went on, Bernard Wetherell, to be Speaker of the House of Commons, had a distinguished career. And Walter Harrison thought for a moment, and he said he thought the consequences for Wetherell if he doesn't vote, you know, he would be ostracised by the Tory party. So he said, I can't have that. We've never had this conversation. We've never had this conversation. None of us will say we've had this conversation until one of us dies. Completely true story this. And so what do? They do not bring down the doctor. The Labour government falls by 1. And Jim Callaghan, who knows nothing of this, who is the Prime Minister at the time, when he's out of office and Mrs Thatcher is in Downing Street, he writes to Walter Harrison and says, you did the right thing. And Walter Harrison carried that in his breast pocket. He was a former miner, actually, until, and in fact, he was buried with him, I think, the letter, when he was a miners' band marched him through 3 or 4 years ago through the pit village where he lived and died. So all I say in that story is that, you know, I think there is hope for our democracy. We've had 2 referendums that have torn our country apart in many ways in terms of opinions, but they've energised the young. And perhaps the only victim of those 2 referendums, sadly killed by a madman, was my colleague Jo Cox. And I leave you with her words, which have now become famous, that together we share far more things in common than divide us. Thank you very much.